intended not only to help us understand what's going on, but also to sort of give an interpretation, right? That this is what the a tradition, whether it's Rashi or it's a later commentary, has decided that this is what the Gemara means, right? So there's a lot of additional words, as you see. We don't always have to take these words as being exactly what they mean. So we can play it a little bit. All right. So the evening prayer is not fixed to a specific hour, right? It can be recited throughout the night. So whenever you get around to it, it's good.
What does the evening prayer say?
Okay, so that's great. All right, so the evening prayer, right? So the prayers in Judaism are linked to the sacrifices that were in the temple. So every day in the temple, there were the regular offerings. There was the morning offering and there was the afternoon offering. There was no evening offering. So there's already going to be an issue, right, when we talk about the evening prayer, right? So some people are going to say, we'll see later, right, that is an optional prayer. You don't really need to say it, right? On the other hand, there are people who are going to say, no, of course, it's not optional at all. It's you got to say it, right? So that's basically where we're going to run into the beginning of our story, right? So the Gemara asks, and it's interesting, right, that the Gemara here is asking the question that our translation of the Gemara has already answered, right? Hello. Oh, hello, Emily.
Hi there.
This is our Talmud group. So we're learning the Talmud. Very. This is quite a story. Lots of fireworks in this story. All right. Even though you might not think so, because it begins talking about.
Seems mild.
It seems mild, exactly. So what is the meaning of it is not fixed, right? If you say that if one wishes, he may pray throughout the night, then the Mishnah should teach it that way. It should be explicit. What is this whole it's not fixed, right? It should say that the evening prayer can be recited throughout the night. Say it for real. So it clearly does not mean that. So what does it mean that it's not fixed? All right. So it is in accordance with the opinion of the one who said. So this is often the case, right? There is going to be a tradition. Right? We don't know exactly whom to assign the tradition to, so we'll just say the person who said this must agree with that, right? So it means, what does it mean? The evening prayer is optional, right? You can say it, but if you don't say it, hellfire and damnation are not going to descend upon your head, right? You're going to be okay, all right? So as Rabbi Yehuda said, that Shmuel said in regard to the evening prayer, Rabban Gamliel says, what does he say? It's obligatory, right? Rabban Gamliel is the tough guy, right? He's the strict taskmaster, right? It is obligatory, right? You can't skip it. Okay. Rabbi Yehoshua, he is our sort of easygoing, more lax, right? Kind of a teacher, right? He says, it's optional, right? A later generation, Abaye, a later generation says, the halacha, right? The rule, the way that comes down to us as being the actual practice of traditional Jews, right, is that we should go along with the statement of the one who said the evening prayer is obligatory, right? Rava, who is Abaye's counterpart in that generation, what does he say? Nah, you're wrong. It goes according to the statement of the one who said that the evening prayer is optional, right?
The evening prayer meant to close off all prayer for the rest of the 24-hour period, because if it does, and you plan to pray through the night, you've got a problem.
Yeah, well, that's a really interesting question, Naomi. I love that question because it actually that puts us into a position of needing to ask, well, what do we mean by prayer?
Okay.
Right? So do we mean by prayer petitions to God? Or do we mean, or a sort of say, or a recitation of sacred texts? Or do we mean by prayer a specific set of traditional texts that we say, which is what we know today as the Amidah, right? So the Amidah, the standing prayer, is it's called the 18 prayers, right? The 18 benedictions, even though these days it has 19, right? Again, just in case you want to try to take a pin, right, and stick it through the heart of the butterfly, right, of that represents Judaism, it's almost impossible to do, right, because it's going to flutter away, right, and be slightly different, right. So the answer to your question, I don't have a hard and fast answer to your question, but in terms of the number of times that you say the Amidah during the day, right, you're supposed to say it 3 times, right, the morning, the afternoon, and the evening, right. Now, of course, the question is, as we see here, and it's a question that goes through the generations, right? It never gets, it gets fully resolved in the sense that, most Orthodox Jews today pray 3 times, right? But in the Talmud, right, it's still this question. Is it optional or is it not optional? But the idea is that the last thing you say every day is the Shema, right? You say the Shema when you're going to bed. So, yeah, go ahead.
How doesn't that mean law?
Halacha has been used as meaning Jewish law. Halacha actually means like the Jewish path, the way of walking. So really more like Jewish practice, right? More than...
And that's the context in which it is used
exactly.
here. Okay, because the law, in my understanding,
right,
is law and not open to interpretation, not by me,
right,
but by orthodoxy.
Well, that's what's really interesting, is that there is no halacha, there's no law in Judaism that is not at least theoretically, right, open to challenge and change, right? Now, obviously, that's theoretical, right? I don't think we're going to have Orthodox rabbis debating on whether or not it's actually obligatory or optional to pray the evening prayer, right? That's kind of a settled case, right? That they do. But since the Talmud is the base of the curricula, right, for an Orthodox rabbi, right? Well, then yes, Orthodox rabbis are going to be debating back and forth. Some of them are going to take the side of Abaye and Rabban Gamliel, and some of them are going to take the side of Rava and Rabbi Yehoshua, right? And they're going to argue it on the merits, right? All right. So so just remember, right? It's I find it to be much more helpful to translate halacha as Jewish practice or Jewish way, right? Because it's not legal, right, in the sense that we think about it in our legal tradition. Although, of course, in our legal traditions, we found that we had a Voting Rights Act, right? But various state legislatures and the Supreme Court seem to think that that's not worth keeping as a law, right? Because it's very important to make sure that white people can vote and black people can't, right? So we changed the law, right? And just in case people are wondering, obviously I'm completely vermished and really upset and outraged about that situation. Okay, so the sages taught. Okay, so now very often in the Talmud, right, we get to a situation where multiple generations of rabbis have the same disagreement, right? What do we do? Do we say this one was right and that one was wrong?
Nope.
Never. I mean, not never, but rarely. Rarely do we do that, right? Much more likely, what are we going to do? Tell the story.
kidding.
Time to tell a story. All right. So there was a story, right? Here's a Misa, right? You've heard the word Misa, maybe, right?
Yes.
Yes, you, but certainly Sandy has heard the word Misa, right? So, and that comes from the Hebrew word Ma'aseh, right? Ma'aseh, which is an incident or a doing, right? A story, right? Or a deed, right? Exactly. So I'm just going to turn. I'm going to turn Sandy's volume down here, so that when she talks, I don't jump into Hetty's lap. Okay. All right.
Imagine when they turn you on.
Oh my God, it's going to be really something when they turn me on. I'm going to be just pure cacophony. All right. So the sages taught there was an incident involving a student, right? And so the last time I read this, I became interested in this student. What is the student's motivation? So, I mean, not that you know now, but as we're reading through the story, think about what is the student's motivation. I'm really interested to get your take on it, right?
It's an answer.
Well, okay, but that's what I initially would have thought. But as the story goes, right, maybe there's more to. I don't know, right? Okay, so the sages taught there was an incident involving a student who came before Rabbi Yehoshua. The student said to him, "Is the evening prayer optional or obligatory?" We already know what Rabbi Yehoshua said, right? Because it was in the introduction to the story. It's optional. We don't, he's not going to make you say it if you don't want to. Okay. So what happens next? The same student came before Rabban Gamliel. What the heck is he doing? And said to him, "Is the evening prayer optional or obligatory?" Rabban Gamliel said, "It's obligatory," right? And the student, innocently, right, without any other motivation. This is what I don't know. I don't know. Obviously, it could be without
This
motivation,
is his motivation.
right? Who knows? What
To start a quarrel.
Right? He has to start a quarrel, or maybe the rabbis just needed a sap, right, to get a quarrel started for the story. So I don't know.
Maybe it's on top of the rabbi ended the piece. That's what the rabbi's saying.
Right.
Maybe.
Who knows? So, but wait, said the student. Didn't Rabbi Yehoshua tell me that the evening prayer is optional? Now, Rabban Gamliel tends to be kind of a hard ass, right? So he's not going to be happy. Rabban Gamliel is the leader of the generation. He's the Nasi, right? He's the head of the rabbinic court, right? And so Rabban Gamliel said to the student, "Wait until the masters of the shields," right? Very interesting, right? How Rabban Gamliel characterizes Torah study, right? This is not just a bunch of collegial people hanging around, right, and discussing the finer points of Torah, right? These rabbis are like gladiators, right? Battle in the War of Torah. The War of Torah. I don't know where they came up with that. That's even worse than but anyway. So Rabban Gamliel is just wait till Rabbi Yehoshua gets here, right, and then you're going to see some fireworks, right? Okay. So when the masters of the shield. So this is one of those great things about Talmudic stories. Right, is that time just goes, so who knows why Rabbi Yehoshua showed up to Rabban Gamliel's study hall? What's is it an everyday occurrence? Is it something that happened after a few months? This is one of those things we just don't know, right? But when they all came together, right, the questioner, right, so now he is upgraded from a student to a questioner, right? Or maybe he's downgraded, I don't know. But he asks the question, right? And he stood before everyone present, it says, right? So the whole group of rabbis is all hanging out, right? Is the evening prayer optional or obligatory? Rabban Gamliel says it's obligatory, right? So Rabban Gamliel said to the sages, and I think it's important here, right, that Rabbi Yehoshua does not pipe up immediately and say, "No, what are you talking about, Rabban Gamliel? It's optional. Rabbi Yehoshua just is silent. Right? So Rabban Gamaliel has to say, is there any person who disputes this matter? Right? He wants Yehoshua to get up and have a fight. And Rabbi Yehoshua says to him, no. Right? Rabbi Yehoshua says it. It's as though he knows, right, that he's the one that has been reported as having a different opinion. So we get here, right, to this. Let's get to the end of this one, right? In deference to the Nasi, it says, right, he did not wish to argue with him publicly. All right. So this one is enough of an interpretation, right, that the translation actually gives a reference to this, whoever this rabbi is who makes this idea, right? But can we think of other reasons why Rabbi Yehoshua wouldn't want to argue with Rabban Gamaliel?
He'd lose.
I'm sorry?
He'd lose.
He'd lose. Okay, so he'd lose, right? Or
He just doesn't want to start.
he just doesn't want to get into it, whatever it
He want
is.
to start a war.
Right.
In the middle of this grand
To
assembly.
keep the peace, right? Maybe just to keep the peace,
Right.
right? Maybe it is to show deference, right? I mean, Rabban Gamaliel is, after all, the boss, right?
He
Right?
doesn't want to get fired.
He doesn't want to get fired, right? But it's very interesting, right, that we see here where Rabban Gamaliel is kind of being a bully, right? And we see that what does that behavior elicit? Right? It elicits silence,
Yeah.
right? Which means that the debate is not entered. Right? We can't come to a conclusion, right? We can't figure out what the truth is, right? If everybody who has a different opinion just shuts up and defers to the boss.
But Gamaliel is not going to leave it alone.
But Rabban Gamaliel is not going to leave it alone. Right, exactly.
Also, is there not a difference between opinion and fact?
Well, that's a really interesting question, right? So I think that, yes, there is, right? I think it's reasonably clear, right, that I don't think we would get a lot of argument about the fact, right? I'm using scare quotes because, that the rabbis based the prayers that we have, they based them on the sacrificial system that predated the rabbis, right? So that when the temple was destroyed, right, we began to have a morning prayer in place of the morning sacrifice and an afternoon prayer in place of the afternoon sacrifice. So that's fact.
So before that, there was only the act of sacrifice.
Right. When there was a temple, actually it's not clear, as with many of these things, right, it's quite possible, and I think that here what we have, that in actual fact, right, what we have is a situation where there are really two systems, right? There was a system of prayers and there was a system of sacrifices, and when the system of sacrifices was removed, right, by the destruction of the temple, right, there was an effort to put them together, right? I'm not claiming this from any sort of historical, I don't have historical basis for this. I'm just imagining, right, that the rabbis are trying to talk about the continuity between the older system and their newer system. Go ahead, Phyllis.
But staying with the newer system, I know the English translation you've given us is optional.
Right.
But what that depends on is whether they mean it's optional in terms of the time it's said, or optional in terms of whether or not it's said at all.
Right.
So that word usually in that context, optional means whether it's said at all.
Right. And I think in
what
this,
is the Hebrew?
it's reshut.
I mean, and
The word is reshut in Hebrew,
And what does that mean?
What-
and it means optional. It means
It just-
it means it's up to you.
Yeah.
Right, it's up to you. And so I think, right, that and whether or not what these guys mean is optional or something else, right, the Talmud has already put aside, right, it's already said, no, it doesn't mean it can be said all night, right, because if it did mean that, it would say explicitly, you can say it all night. So it doesn't mean that, it must mean optional. Now we can agree or disagree with that argument, but that's the terms under which the Talmud is reading this current thing, right? That it's optional, right? And so Francine, to get back to your question, right? Even if we agree to the fact that the prayer system is based on the sacrificial system, right? There is no fact of an evening sacrifice, right? So that is an opinion, right? Perforce, you have to make an opinion about it, right? It's something to be argued about, right? At this point in the development of rabbinic Judaism, as I said later on, right? We all know that we have to pray 3 times a day, and there are no exceptions.
And that's current thinking?
That's our current halacha, current normative, if you want to use that word, or traditional Jewish practice demands that we pray 3 times a day, and it's not optional, right? The Talmud here is depicting a time at which that question was still under discussion, right?
I'm amused by the word tradition, because every time my born-again granddaughter, the Orthodox one, says it's traditional or in the Jewish tradition, and I silently think not my tradition.
Exactly.
How are you using that word?
Exactly. And this is why I like practice, halacha, right, as opposed to law, because we understand that as soon as you've got 2 different communities, even if they're both Orthodox communities, right, they may interpret Jewish practice differently and have a different halacha. They might have a different practice, right? And certainly a Reform Jew has a different practice than an Orthodox Jew, right? And so on many things, not on all things, but on many things, right?
Back in that time, would Gamliel feel that, well, we lost the sacrifice, why should we lose the Amida?
Well, right, but I don't know if that's his. I mean, you could make an argument, right, that on the contrary, you are actually losing the connection to the sacrifices if you insist that the evening prayer is obligatory, right? Because the other 2 make sense, right? You can clearly identify a morning and an afternoon sacrifice. Those correspond to the prayers. If you insist that the evening prayer is also obligatory, you're making up a sacrifice that didn't exist, and you are weakening the connection to the sacrifices, right? On the other hand, right, if it's very important to sort of Jewish uniformity, right, everyone must do the same thing, right? Then we don't want things to be optional. God forbid, right, that the Jews over here say the evening prayer and the Jews over here don't say it. Right? So the Rabban Gamliel maybe is more about sort of a totalizing kind of ideology. All right. So in any case, Rabban Gamliel wants to have this fight, right? Whether it's because he doesn't want to leave it unresolved, right, or because he's just a bully. Hey, Larry. He says, "But was it not in your name that they told me that the evening prayer is optional? I heard from a little bird told me, right, that you have this heterodox opinion. So come on, have the courage of your convictions. Get up and argue it." All right. So what does he say? Rabban Gamliel said to Rabbi Yehoshua, stand on your feet, and they will testify against you. Wow.
Who is they?
Well, that is a very good question. So let's see if we can figure out who they is, right? Because What kind of a word is they? It is a
Pronoun.
pronoun that indicates that there are how many people?
Many.
At least
More
two.
than one.
At least two. How many people did Rabban Gamliel hear from that Rabbi Yehoshua has? One person. Now, one of the bases of Jewish law, right, is that you cannot be convicted according to the testimony of only one person. Right? You need to have two people need to have seen whatever the crime is and need to agree upon the story. Right? So Rabban Gamliel is already playing a little fast and loose, right? By saying they are going to testify. So I'm interested to see now, well, who is it that testified, right? All right. But we don't see, actually, right? We don't see. All we see is that Rabbi Yehoshua stood on his feet and said, if I were alive and the student were dead, well, the living can contradict the dead, right? He's dead. He can't argue with me, right? But now that I am alive and he is alive, how can the living contradict the living? Right? He's not going to. And interestingly, right, he does not go to the place that I just went to. Right? You only heard it from one person,
Yeah.
right? So clearly, he's not at this point trying to shy away from it.
But he also, it doesn't say that he said that.
He doesn't, right? He doesn't acknowledge it,
Right.
right? But he doesn't not. He doesn't deny it, right? He just doesn't contradict.
But look at the next line.
Yes. Yeah, but again, right? Again, that is in the non-bolded script,
Yeah.
right? So that is already the interpretation of later generations. And I'm not saying that they're wrong, right? I'm not saying that they're wrong, right? That the gloss is incorrect. But I do, one of the things I love about, like what Shirley just said, right, is that we don't have to read the Talmud exactly the way the tradition read it, right? We can say, well, the words on the page are this, right? And so we want to understand it this way. So yeah, the tradition says, okay, yeah, I admit it, right? But I think it's more elegant to say that Yehoshua, who is a very, very clever rabbi, right, doesn't actually cop to it, but he doesn't deny it either, right? He can neither confirm nor deny, right, that I said what I was purported to say. All right. In the meantime, Rabban Gamliel, as the Nasi, right, I said before he's the Nasi, he's sort of like the president or the chief or whatever, right, was sitting and lecturing, right? Get the body language here, right? He was sitting and lecturing, and Rabbi Yehoshua all the while was standing on his feet, because Rabban Gamliel, being a bully, right, did not instruct him to sit. He remained standing in deference to the Nasi. This continued for some time until it aroused great resentment against Rabban Gamliel. And all of the people, right, Kol Ha'am, all of the people in the room began to murmur. Right? They began to get upset with Rabban Gamliel. And then they finally act. And they they said the chutzpit hatarguman, or turgaman, as it's turgaman as it's pointed here. So chutzpit, the turgaman, the disseminator, really sort of the loudspeaker. So Rabban Gamliel would be just talking in a normal voice, right? And the loudspeaker would speak like Rabbi Jim talks at this ridiculously loud volume, right? All right. Stop. So they cut his mic, right? So what do we do when someone is saying things that we don't like, or it's time for him to get the hook, right? These days we just turn off the microphone, right, and no one can hear him. In those days, you tell the guy who speaks loudly to stop speaking. he does, and he stopped. So Rabban Gamaliel is basically kicked off his dais. Very interesting, right?
It's an insurrection.
It's an insurrection, exactly, or rebellion, right? Depending on how you value these things, right? Was it a rebellion or an insurrection, right? Is it a good thing or a bad thing? We'll see. All right. So the Gemara relates that in their murmuring they said, right? So all the rabbis, right, are getting together and they said, "How long will Rabban Gamliel continue to afflict him?" Right. So clearly, this bullying behavior is nothing new, right? There's a history here, right? There's a history of bad blood between Rabban Gamliel and Rabbi Yehoshua. Right, so last year on Rosh Hashanah, he afflicted him. Right, so the story there, I'll read this and then I'll try to explain the story. Rabban Gamliel ordered Rabbi Yehoshua to come to him carrying his staff and bag on the day on which Yom Kippur occurred, according to Rabbi Yehoshua's calculations. Right, so every year, right, there was an art. These days we don't have it, right? We sort of, our Jewish calendar is, we figured out how to sort of set the Jewish calendar. Back in the day, there was sort of there would be a decision: is today the new moon or is tomorrow the new moon, right? And so there was a time when Rabban Gamliel and Rabbi Yehoshua had two different opinions about when the new moon was, which means which day was Rosh Hashanah. And Rabban Gamliel decided to impose regularity and order, right, by forcing Rabbi Yehoshua to do what?
To carry stuff.
To carry and to travel on Yom Kippur, right? Right. You know, so basically a power play to demonstrate that he's in charge, right? And Rabbi Yehoshua is not. And so this is very interesting, right? Again, like the value here of, well, everybody needs to agree on when Yom Kippur is. We can't have Naomi saying that Yom Kippur is going to be on October 15th, and Rabbi Jim is saying that it's going to be on October 16th, right? Because people are going to show up for services on the 15th, and they're going to be like, where's the service, right? And then those same people are going to show up on the 16th and say, you're a day late and $1 short, right? Whereas other people, so you got to have some communal consistency, right? So you sort of understand it from Rabban Gamliel's perspective, right? On the other hand, right, if you have a system in which different communities can make rulings for themselves, right, and it's important to have that kind of pluralism, right? Where do you draw the line, right, between communal consistency and congregational independence, so to speak, right? Right. This is a problem in all kinds of different places, right? So in the Catholic Church, right, how much congregational independence is there? At least from a liturgical perspective, very, very little, right? And then one of the reasons we have what's called congregational churches, right, in this country. What is congregational church? It means that the congregation makes all the decisions for themselves. They do whatever the heck they want, right? And the whatever central authority there is, the United Church of Christ, right, has very little say. What kind of Judaism do we have by and large in the land of Israel?
Orthodox.
Well, or we have a lot of Orthodox Jews here too, right? But there is a rabbanut, right? There is a rabbinate that makes all the decisions, right? Whereas in this country, right, even the Orthodox shuls, right, organize according to their own. Because we're Americans, right? It's very important to Americans that we have a congregational system. No problem. You can catch the rest of it on YouTube if you're so interested, right? So this question here that the Talmud is asking, right, is a very relevant question for people who belong to various types of congregations today. All right. And then there was regarding the firstborn. In the incident involving the question of Rabbi Tzadok, he afflicted him, right, and forced him to remain standing as punishment for his failure to defend his differing opinion. Very interesting, right? Rabbi Yehoshua just wants to withdraw. I don't want to get into, and why might he do that?
To avoid trouble.
Could be to avoid trouble, absolutely, right? Shlom Bait, right? The idea of peace in the house, right? But it also could be that he wanted to avoid either being completely defeated or defeating Rabban Gamliel, right? That he wanted to leave the question open, right? And so there's a way in which what we can see here is less maybe cowardice on the part of Rabbi Yehoshua, right? And more of a desire to maintain questions that have not been definitively decided. I don't know if that's right or not.
But why?
What do you do with that?
Hold on, excuse me 1 second. I just need to chase that away. Say it again, Frank. Why? So why might we want to leave certain questions open as opposed to having a definitive decision about them? Go ahead, Mark.
Well, it's contradictory to the difference. In other words, if it's decided, he loses.
Well, I mean,
He doesn't lose, but he doesn't gain the difference of his opinion.
well, right. Okay, so right. So, although in the Talmud, even when a question is definitively decided in the Talmud, right? Generally, the opposing opinion is kept, right? So there's so many famous ones, but one famous one is, right, how do we light Hanukkah candles? Right, we start with one, and every day we add, right? But the Talmud records, right, that Beit Shammai did it the opposite way, right? Was there really a Beit Shammai who did it the opposite way, or was it just like we need to have an alternative tradition, so let's make one up for Beit Shammai? I don't know, right? Yeah, go ahead, Phyllis.
Well, in choosing the side of being optional,
Right.
he is betraying his personality.
Yes.
He likes to leave it up to the individual.
Right. So he has a desire for openness, right? A desire for openness within, obviously, probably within certain limits, right? But he wants to maintain that openness. Rabban Gamliel wants to nail it down, right? Yeah, go ahead.
It's almost like a form of peaceful protest.
Right.
He was trying to gain a congregation on his side because he had no one with him at the beginning. It was just him.
Right.
So
Right. And now he's got everybody on his side. Right?
Yes.
They're like,
the other guy.
we're not going to, so what does he say? Let us remove him. Right? We're going to impeach him. That's it. No more Rabban Gamliel. Right? That's it. So we have some sort of, precedent in the Talmud, right? For the notion that an ineffective or otherwise inappropriate leader, right, can be removed,
knocked down.
right? So hey, if obvious, and what the exact terms of it are, I'm not, who knows, right? I don't know if this is, I don't know if there was ever a time when historical people pointed back to this kind of mythological text and said, look, this, they did this in the Talmud, so, so anyway, so what happened? So it was so agreed, right? So let's get rid of them. But then they have a problem, right? Who's going to be the Nasi instead of Rabban Gamliel? Right? So there's a couple of candidates, right? How about Rabbi Yehoshua, right? The one who sort of embodies the opposite impulse of Gamliel for full uniformity, right? Rabbi Yehoshua is sort of this sort of gentler, he's not going to make people stand up all day, right? He's not going to make people travel on the day that's Yom Kippur, whatever, blah, 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 right? Do we want him? And the sages say no, we don't want him. Why don't we want him? Right? The stated reason, right, is that he's part of the dispute, right? You don't you don't depose he, and I would go further, right? And I would say that Rabbi Yehoshua is not asking for it, right? He just didn't want to engage in that conversation, right? He didn't ask to be the boss. And you can sort of imagine, right, that a guy who's unwilling to make decisions for other people would not necessarily be a very effective boss, right? You need people to take stands when they're the boss, even if it's unpopular sometimes, right? All right. So appointing him would be extremely upsetting for Rabban Gamliel. I love that, right? We don't want to make Rabban Gamliel upset. He's not going to be upset that we're taking him out of his job, right? But he will be upset if we put in his job the guy that he was making fun of, right? Oh, whatever. Okay. So shall we establish Rabbi Akiva? So does everyone know who Rabbi Akiva is?
No.
Okay, so Rabbi Akiva is one of the great sages of the Torah, of the Talmud. He is described by my teacher Art Green as the great romantic of the Torah, of the Talmud, right? That all you need is love, according to Akiva, right? He is the one that decided that the Song of Songs should be part of the biblical canon, right? Even though really it's just a risque love song, right? And he has a big love story with his wife, right? He leaves his wife at the age of 40 to become a Torah scholar, right? And if you want to read, there's two books that have sort of fictionalized versions of Rabbi Akiva's life that are worth a look. One is an old one. It's called As a Driven Leaf. You may have heard of it by Milton Steinberg, I think is his name. And then there's a more recent one by Yochi Brandis called the Orchard, and that's a sort of slightly more sort of feminist version of it. So both very interesting novels. All right. So what about Akiva? Sages say no, right? Because he was descended from a family of converts, right? I can never be the Nasi, right? I'll never be the head of the rabbinic court in Israel. Okay, all right, it's fine. Again, who would want to be? Right. Right. So people could make fun of him, right? And perhaps due to Rabban Gamliel's resentment, Rabban Gamliel would cause him to be divinely punished, right? Remember, the Talmud has this sort of idea that these rabbis have vaguely even kind of magical powers, right? They can sort of control things and make life really difficult for people. So he doesn't have the merit of his ancestors to protect him, right?
I mean, because they're not Jewish,
the ancestors aren't Jewish, so they can't protect him from Rabban Gamliel, right?
Because they don't have merit, or that's just the way.
That's just the way it's. They don't have Jewish merit, right? They have whatever merit they have, but it's not Jewish merit, so it doesn't count when you're dealing with Rabban Gamliel, right? Yeah, these are the parts of the Talmud where you just go, "Oy, kafui, what are you going to do?" But it's a relevant question, is what we'll see later, right? We'll see later, probably next week we'll have to see this, right? It won't be this week, right? And so finally, the sages said, let us establish Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah in his place, right? His outstanding characteristics set him apart from the other candidates. He is wise, he is rich, and a 10th generation descendant of Ezra, right? Of Ezra the scribe, right? A big deal, right? He is wise. So if Rabban Gamliel raises a challenge to him in matters of Torah, right, he will be able to defend himself, right, and not be embarrassed. Because I don't know here, right, if the idea is that somehow the Talmud here is, or the sages are assuming, right, that the reason that Rabbi Yehoshua did not answer Rabban Gamliel was because he was going to be embarrassed. Right, I actually don't think that's the case, right? As we'll see later, but the sages may have assumed that because how did Rabbi Yehoshua always respond to Rabban Gamliel? Just silence, right? It's as though he didn't have anything to say. Right? All right, and he is rich, so if the need arises to pay homage to the Romans, right? If he has to pay a bribe, right? Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah has money. Right, and he knows how to hobnob with the Romans. Right, Rabbi Akiva, not so much. Right, Rabbi Yehoshua, certainly not. right? Rabbi Yehoshua is extremely poor, as we will find out later, right? Rabbi Yehoshua is also known as the ugliest of all the rabbis. So probably the Romans would not be interested in hanging out with him, because the Romans were notoriously focused on beauty. Right?
Image.
All right. So he too is able to go and pay homage, and he is a 10th generation descendant of Ezra. So he has the merit of his ancestors, and Rabban Gamliel will be unable to cause him to be punished, by whatever part of God punishes people for being converts. Hopefully I don't ever encounter that part of God. All right. So they said to him and said, would the master consent? Hold on one second. Sorry. Would the master consent? Oh boy. I lost it. Boy. Oh, I really lost it.
Yeah.
Sorry, everybody. Really do not know what happened there. There we go. Okay. Would the master consent to being the head of the yeshiva? He said, I will go and consult with my household. Right? And he went and he consulted to his wife. When we say bait in the Talmud, right? We learned this a couple weeks ago. When we say bait, meaning house, we mean our wife, right? Okay. So he went and consulted with his wife. Now, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah's wife is one of my favorite characters because she's like no BS. She's like completely. She says to him, perhaps they're going to remove you from office, just like they removed Rabban Gamliel. What makes you so special? Right? He said to her, based on the folk saying, let a person use an expensive goblet one day and let it break tomorrow. Right? So even if I get to be the Nasi for just one day, right? That's great. That would be enough. It would be like being president for a day or being king for a day. Right? It's a great thing. I'll be king for a day and then let them put the other guy back. Fine, whatever. Right? So she says, okay, well, fine. But wait, the problem is you have no white hair. Right? You're too young. You're a whippersnapper. And you're going to pretend that you can preside over all these, these grizzled rabbis. Right? So the Gemara says, yep, he was 18 years old, right? He was not just a young man, he was a boy, right? He was still a boy, right? And a miracle transpired for him, and 18 rows of his hair turned white. That explains why that which Rabban Elazar ben Azariah said, I am as one who is 70 years old. And he did not say, I am 70 years old, right? Because that would be a lie. He's not 70 years old. He's like one who's 70 years old because he has 18 rows of white hair. Right? His one for each day of his life, I guess. I don't know. There's probably all kinds of great midrashim about that.
The completion, like 18.
Yes, right, exactly. Like high, right? So there's probably a lot you can do with it, but I didn't look it up, so... Anyway, so let's stop there, all right, and we'll come back next week, and we will see what happens, right? Because this is quite a compelling story, to my opinion. It's a compelling story.
Is there going to be a dispute between appearance and substance?
Well, yes, there will be, right? There will be that. There will also be a showdown between Rabbi Yehoshua and Rabban Gamliel, right? We will eventually find that Rabbi Yehoshua is not unwilling to have an argument with Rabban Gamliel when the stakes seem high enough, right? Or maybe when Rabban Gamliel is no longer the Nasi, right, and is not in a position, right, to make pronouncements and to enforce these sort of crazy things. Go ahead.
I'm wondering, I came in late, excuse me, I'll set my way, I had to cut it late. But I'm wondering if this particular example that we're using, or this particular section and all that, has a reason to be chosen for an overarching reason between these two.
Yeah.
Is there, I lost something in the context.
Yes, you did. Okay, so the very beginning, Maureen, and this might be just helpful as a final review for people, right, is the whole thing starts in the context of a disagreement about whether or not the evening prayer is obligatory or optional, right? And Rabban Gamliel says that it's obligatory. Rabbi Yehoshua says that it's optional, right? And that's how this whole thing starts, right? And part of the larger sort of dispute between Rabban Gamliel and Rabbi Yehoshua, obviously there's lots of pieces to it, but one of them has to do, as I think I've said along the way, right, about what is the communal practice and how uniform does that communal practice have to be, right? And so there's going to be obviously a range of opinions all over the place, right? And what's really interesting, of course, right, is that it's as Francine often encounters. Is that with your daughter? You said
Granddaughter.
with your granddaughter, right? That the tradition says X,
The tradition.
right? Like as if there is one tradition, right? And it's wholly unitary and univocal, right? But what's also very funny, right, is that I know plenty of people who are not Orthodox, right, say for the sake of argument that they're Reform or Conservative, and they are very happy to say, oh, come on, there's more than one tradition. Reform Jews do this, right? So as soon as they're in their own little subgroup, then they're very comfortable with a unitary and univocal understanding of things, right? But so again, like as if, right, Reform Jews are in any way a monolith, right? Reform Jews are all over the place, right? As all Jews are, especially in this country, are all over the place.
Don't they say two Jewish people, three opinions?
100%.
Oh, yeah, something
Yeah,
like
I've
that.
heard that.
Exactly.
Right. Is that
Two
right?
Jews, three opinions.
Yeah.
I've
100.
got 2 Jews, 3 arguments.
Right. So they're so and again, and I do think that is the if sort of the larger takeaway, at least at this point of this story, right, is how important it is, right, for there to be free flowing disagreement and discussion in our tradition, right? That not only are we allowed to disagree, right, that in fact if a situation arises where disagreement and discussion are not possible, right, because of the misuse of power, right, that situation has to be mitigated.
What was the phrase? Shields of the Torah. Something.
The let's see.
That was a good phrase.
Yes,
Yeah.
right.
What was it though?
And
I can't remember it.
I'll tell you in just a second. Right here, the masters of the shields. Masters of Baalei Tarisin, I think it is in the Aramaic.
Oh, I love it.
Yeah, Baalei Tarisin. Right. So that is a really interesting question, right? Do we agree with Rabban Gamliel that Torah scholars should be warriors, right? Or do we more agree with Rabbi Yehoshua, right, who doesn't want to get into a dispute, right, if the terms of that dispute are sort of warlike, right? He seems to be not interested, right, in a discussion that is akin to combat.
But not only that, at that moment when that was said, the masters of the shields were on the side of Rabbi Gamliel anyway.
Right.
And he didn't want to fight all of them,
Right.
maybe, possibly.
Right. I mean, who knows? Exactly. Right. So I like that opinion. Right. Is that sometimes you're going to get you're better off by not starting the argument, right, and instead sort of maneuvering. Right? So anyway, to be continued. Next week we will. I don't know if we'll finish the whole thing. It's a long piece, But we'll do our best to finish because the following week is going to be a special program. So,
Thank you, Rabbi.
all right. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye, Sandy.
So long.
There.